This is a summary of Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. So, Chapter 1 talks about how mankind is deluded by oceanic feelings of eternity and the transcendent, and that this stops us from considering the reality principle, whereby it justifies the need for psychoanalysis to assess the hidden striatum of the mind, similar to how Rome was built, developed with more and more additional levels of complexity. Chapter 2 talks about the reality principle, which is the realization of the current situation, and this regulates both the superego and the libido. It's basically an emphasis on the ego, which is the regulation of the other two systems. And we come to develop this realization of the reality principle through meditation, yoga, or work, art, creativity, which manifests the imagination, or through displacing our libidinal desires, sublimating it into tangible reality, as in putting it into other usage. As a consequence, we may want to accept or reject the world due to experiencing the problem of suffering and the reality principle. The rejection of the world includes people becoming insane, turning into madmen, developing a psychosis, or people turning into hermits or mystics, stuff like that. The premise of this chapter is that religion is a mass delusion to shield people from the suffering reality. This, however, presupposes and assumes that the ultimate aim is the pleasure principle, to seek pleasure and flee harm. Religion is a psychic infantilism, according to Freud. And, well, I would counter with the counter argument that Freud and his psychoanalytic tradition is also kind of a form of psychic infantilism, because this presupposes that the pleasure principle is the be-all and end-all. Seeking pleasure are for infants and children. Seeking eudaimonia, or fulfillment, and meaning is the greatest reality principle of all, and this allows adults to endure suffering. Chapter 3. Civilization has produced a great many things, like the arts, sciences, and technology. However, there are dichotomies, such as individual freedom versus the mass collective, ideas such as the noble savage versus the oppressive rule of law, and social structures and dictates that govern the lives of a civilized man. Freud brought up orderliness and cleanliness compared to disorder, which was another product of civilization. Because when you look at the animals, or if you look at pre-civilized man, they were not so concerned with keeping order, with keeping cleanliness in check. Though that could also be that cleanliness is a much later development, possibly arising due to domestication of animals and being exposed to more and more viruses, bacteria, pathogens. But I digress. Chapter 4. Freud believes that civilizations that develop were based on the realization that man can modify their environment through work and to control their sexual desires into narrowly defined areas, such as within the bounds of heterosexual monogamy, which Freud believed was what led to societal development and also simultaneous sexual repression. This premise, that various psychological illnesses have resulted from sexual repression, forms the main basis of Freud's argument for civilization and its discontents. He also linked that cleanliness may be connected to notions of purity, proper rules, to control libidinal desires that keep chaste the sexually immoral, whom could harm society by wasting its resources and time. Chapter 5. Freud finds civilization having sexual repression and a propensity towards aggression, or what he calls the Thanatos, or death drive. He critiques Christianity for the golden rule, love thy neighbor as thyself, and to love thine enemies. Freud calls it credo quia absurdum. I believe it because it is absurd. He cites examples in history where this form of communal libido leads to, ironically, more thanatos. He cited examples such as anti-Semitism or communists fighting against the bourgeoisie, as examples of psychical counterforces. In my own view, I would agree with Freud that the golden rule of love thy neighbor and to love thy enemy is impossible from a human perspective, because it can only originate from an act of God to love those undeserving of love. And thus, I guess that in a way is the premise of Christianity, because in Christianity, it is God who loves those who are undeserving of love. And thus, in a way, I see Freud's attacks on Christianity as actually even strengthening Christianity's position, because it was Christianity that helped to bind separate groups of people together into what we call a civilization, and thus give birth to the Western civilization that we know today. Chapter 6. Freud explicitly introduces the death instinct, or Thanatos. Psychological neuroses are believed to result from the ego or self-preservation suppressing libido, which is necessary to realize and cope with suffering. Narcissism is perceived to be an excess of ego, where it becomes libidinal and pleasurable in its own right. Freud talks about sadism and masochism as libido and thanatos directed either on the self or ego or on the object or others. He then separates out the libido to highlight the existence of Thanatos. Freud, in reality, however, describes that civilizations have a propensity to create and destroy. But I think a critique of this is that this is just a mere description process. It isn't an explanation for how things come to be, as it's not a causal explanation. Moving along, chapter 7, Freud explains how society controls the libido and aggressive instincts through the development of the superego, or the conscience, which tells us that we are guilty of bad thoughts and deeds, and thus it tells us that we need punishment. Freud believes this is an internalization of the father, or of fate or societal pressures, which could lead to social anxiety or other forms of anxiety developing. The superego instills within us guilt and readily amplifies in times of crisis to stop man from indulging hedonically. Freud talked about it originating from the Oedipus complex in wanting to kill a strict or even lenient father, which leads to guilt, and this family dynamic is extended to the community and society. There is something about the internalization of morals from the father that could be true, but the Oedipus complex is completely dubious. Chapter 8, the discontents in civilization all stem from remorse and guilt, according to Freud. Guilt could be conscious or unconscious and can lead to anxiety and supreme suppression of libido. Freud believed that ethics in civilization is civilization's superego, an attempt to change and control individual egos to conform to the will of the society or the community or the nation. Civilizations are extensions of individuals with their superegos embedded within the ethical structures of a society. They are the greatest aims, such as to love thy neighbor as thyself, which Freud saw as impossible, but also an example of the ultimate attempt that civilizations use to forge libidinal ties with everyone else and their community. This leads to conflict where the individual and the collective, the libido and the superego, guilt and aggression play out and influence the whole civilization organism, which could lead to social neurosis. Social neuroses are impossible to treat and assess because they are dependent on entire economies of guilt, and as a result could lead to thanatos for the entire civilization experiment as a whole. Freud makes an interesting assertion that at the heart of our struggle is repression and guilt, and that society or civilization in general suffers from excessive guilt that as a result suppresses the libido, props up the superego, and leads to internal conflict for all, whether consciously or unconsciously. So yeah, that's my summary of Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. Thanks for watching.